This is WNUT Talk on the WNUT Radio Network. This is WNUT Talk. I am Brandon, a.k.a. Stoney. Today, I am sitting here with a stack of CDs in front of me, which normally I don't have an artist discography sitting in front of me when I sit down to do WNUT Talk. There's a lot of shooting from the hip on this show. There's a lot of just kind of, reminiscing. There's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of meandering conversation, that kind of thing. Well, today, it's time. Brian Wilson passed away just last week on June 11th at the age of 82. In fact, he died 9 days before his 83rd birthday. And I wanted to go on to WNUT Talk and open a mic and speak to you guys about Brian Wilson and kind of my love for the Beach Boys and the music that he made. And my journey with Brian Wilson, even though I never knew the guy, he was an important companion, I guess, throughout my life, musically, and providing the soundtrack to my life for decades. But it wasn't like when somebody of that stature dies and is gone. And in Brian Wilson's case, I mean, the man was 82 years old. He had struggled with his health and with mental issues and with drug abuse and with a lot of things over the course of his life. This wasn't something that took us by surprise per se, necessarily. It wasn't like Mark David Chapman coming up and taking John Lennon from the world in 1980. But still, when you lose a person who has contributed so much to so many people, and so many musicians were inspired by, and so many folks look up to, and their music or their art or the things that they have created are so woven into the fabric of our society, and thus who we are and who we will continue to be, I think we all just stop naturally and take stock of what that means to us and how we feel in that moment and what everything means, and how we're going to proceed, how we're going to relate to that person's music the next time we hear it, or next week, or next month, or the years that follow. So, yeah, I wanted to sit down immediately and talk about it because I have a lot to say about Brian Wilson, but it just wasn't time. I didn't feel like I was ready to do that. I don't mean emotionally necessarily. I just mean I needed to gather, a lifetime of thoughts and kind of put those together. And I don't want to sit down and do a bio. I'm not going to tell you who he was. We're going to talk about some of that, but this is not going to be like, here's Brian Wilson's journey. Here's who he was born to, and here's his family story, and here's how the band formed. Like I said, some of that's going to get touched, but it's not going to be that kind of a show. I'm also not just going to be musing on kind of my interactions with the Beach Boys. I think there's something here for everybody. I think I've got something for you today that no matter, even if you don't listen to the Beach Boys, if you're not familiar with what Brian Wilson's done throughout his life, I think there's still something here for you. And if you're a Beach Boys lover, I think there's still something here for you. I think we're going to have a lot in common. So I'm glad that you're here on this journey with us today, here with me. And if you're not familiar with WNUT Talk, maybe this is the first one that you've listened to. I started doing this show a couple of months ago. It's basically just a way for me to sit down and kind of tell some stories or give you some anecdotes or explore a particular idea that I have. Or, we've done shows where I talk about the time Prince changed his name to a symbol and what that entailed. Why did he do it? I had some guests here, the Great Fishniz and the Intern and Agito Live, and we talked about ways that we could ruin some of your favorite TV shows and movies. So WNUT Talk's kind of a versatile just space, for me to fulfill my talk radio fantasies, I guess. So you can listen to this when it debuts for the first time on Live 365. That is the streaming 24-hour-a-day WNUT channel. All you got to do is search on live365.com, search for WNUT, or download the free Live 365 app and search WNUT on there. You can listen to us streaming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is programmed by us here. It is basically just the prime WNUT radio station. Or you can go onto your favorite podcast providers, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, I don't know, YouTube even, and we have it on our channel there. And so, the way that you listen to normal podcasts, you can do that as well. Whichever way you're listening to us, thank you for being here, and we hope that you'll look into one of the other ways and enjoy some of our other fine programming here at WNUT. Nearly 20 years ago now, this was probably 2007, It was maybe late 2007 or early 2008. The date that this happened escapes me. But I was working at a television station then located in North Augusta, South Carolina, called WRDW-TV, or News 12. News 12 has since, it was a CBS affiliate at the time. It has now become the CBS and NBC affiliate and moved across the river into Augusta, serving the Augusta market no matter where it was located. But I was working at WRDW as a photographer. And, I would go out with the reporters, I would shoot stories, I'd bring that back and edit that, and you would see that every day in the newscast at 5 or 6 p.m., sometimes 11 p.m. And I remember I was either leaving to go to a story or I was coming back from the story, and I was getting my stuff out of the Jeep, maybe, taking it back into the station. And I remember I dropped a CD on the sidewalk leading to the newsroom door for where I had been loading my shit out, and I had the music I was listening to that day. And it was just a CD that I had burned myself, and I had handwritten on the disc, what was on it. And basically, it was just a best of the Beach Boys. And I had 2 discs full of Beach Boys stuff that I loved. And one disc was kind of like everything from their early career up to about Pet Sounds. And the second disc was everything after Pet Sounds, all the the more troubled years, as some people know them to be. But anyway, so a guy who was working with me at the time named Steven, he was a photographer for a good bit, and then he transitioned into making promos and commercials and stuff in the marketing department there, which I would eventually do as well. I knew Steven, but he and I hadn't, become like fast friends. We weren't good buddies yet. We didn't know much about each other. We just kind of were coworkers, and I liked him. I thought he was a cool guy. I hope he thought the same of me at that point. But he saw this and he goes, "So you like the Beach Boys?" I said, "Yeah." And I want to say this was the second disc. I want to say this was the later years, because he said something to me at that time that immediately impressed me. He goes, "So you like the post-Pet Sound stuff?" And I said, "Yes. Oh my God." And so few people seem to care what came out after Pet Sounds, or specifically after Good Vibrations, at least for several years, and we'll get to that later. And that began a conversation between me and Steven about our love of the Beach Boys and our love of kind of the more obscure parts of very popular bands' catalogs and the things that a lot of people overlook. And we bonded over that. And it's something I can still talk about with Steven to this day. And he and I have actually written and recorded music inspired by some of those Beach Boys records from back then, both before and after Pet Sounds. But anyway, in the years since that connection with him, it never ceases to amaze me the people who I will randomly bond with over our love of the Beach Boys, and specifically the music that Brian Wilson wrote and recorded and gave the world. This includes folks like Art Brennan, who is a public high school teacher, and he's mostly a Beatles nut. He is a Beatles fanatic, and, I'm a Stones guy, so he and I have some interesting conversations. But the day after Brian Wilson died, there we were talking about how much Brian had given to music and to popular culture and to rock and roll, and kind of bonding over our appreciation for that. It includes guys like Chip Creamer, who was a on-air personality in the Augusta area in news. He's a guy who I learned he once bought a canceled check off of eBay that once had been written by Mike Love, and he bought this just to have some piece of the Beach Boys' existence, just to have some piece of their history, just to have a physical artifact from the Beach Boys' legacy and their existence. And that's so fascinating to me, the idea that he has that and that he loves that. No judgment. And I'm not saying this in any kind of way like, oh, what an eccentric guy. No, that's something I would do. I would probably do something like that. It might not be a canceled check, but I mean, things like that are pretty common for me to, find out there as a memento of something either in my life or something that means a lot to me that somebody else has done. I get it, is what I'm trying to say. Folks like Rob Rock Skipper, who once ran a record store in South Carolina, and I was performing at O'Hara's Public House several years ago for the St. Patrick's Day weekend festivities there and the Shamrock Festival in Lexington. And there's Rob Rock Skipper. He's sitting there in the audience listening to me, and he sketches me. He draws me as I was standing there performing these Irish songs out under this tent under the South Carolina sky somewhere, and I still have that napkin. He did this on a napkin. He gave it to me. We had a conversation and kind of formed a bond there, and I still have that in my book of songs that I take to every gig and that I use when I perform. And Rob Rock Skipper's a great guy, and he's a very artistic guy, and he posted a picture just the other day that he had drawn of Brian Wilson standing there, guitar in hand, with the striped shirt the Beach Boys made famous back in the 60s, playing the music that he loved, out in the California sun, on the sand, and, you know, with the surf crashing gently behind him. So I dig that. I love that. I saved that photo immediately when I saw it. So that's Rob Rock. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, 3 or 4 people, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to, you know, the experiences I've had meeting other people who are inspired like I am by somebody as prolific as Brian Wilson. You know, so many of us find our way to these things, and we draw experiences out of them that are so very unique and so very individual, but also so very similar in so many ways. And that's one of the beautiful things about him, and that's one of the things that I think when we learn that we've lost another giant like him, that we have to stop and take stock of, and so many of us have been doing that this past week. Stick around. We've got to take a break on Live 365. If you're listening to this on a podcast network or something like that, it doesn't apply to you. You're probably just going to hear a WNUT promo, and we'll be right back into it. But if you're listening on Live 365, couple minutes to commercials, I'll be right back to talk about Brian Wilson and to tell you some things that aren't about me and my friends. I'll be right back.
Yo, this is Jimmy Coo from the world of rock, and you're listening to WNUT Going Nuts.
Full episodes at 6, noon, and 8. After Dark, Friday nights at 10. WNUT.
We're back on WNUT Talk. I am Brandon, a.k.a. Stoney, and I am WNUT talking about Brian Wilson today and the Beach Boys and the legacy that he leaves behind him, having just passed away last week at the age of 82, almost 83, if he had just lasted another week and some change. You know, and I said to somebody last week, I was talking actually Art, my friend Art, who I mentioned in the last segment. I was telling Art how cruel the world is to take Brian Wilson from us before he could experience just one more summer, just a tease of summer, and he doesn't even get to experience the you know, one more summer. That to me, that's one of the crueler tricks that fate has played on somebody, on one of our legends. But you know, I was talking about the influence of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, and you cannot overstate, in my opinion, the influence they've had on contemporary music of all kinds. Starting in the 60s when they came out and had their surf hits, you know, when they were making the top 40, like Surfin' USA and Surfin' Safari and Surfer Girl and other things that had surf in the title. I mean, look, surfing wasn't the only thing they wrote about. They also wrote about cars. You know, you had Shutdown, you had Little Deuce Coupe, you had 409. It was a surf and car culture in California in the 60s. Not that I was there, but just, you know, listening to folks who were like the Wilson brothers and their cousin Mike Love and others. I could sort of tell, you know, we were being true to our school, and as soon as the bell rang, we were getting out there and we were driving around in these cars and impressing our friends and cruising down to the beach, and we were probably taking that surfboard and wishing the sun a fond farewell, you know, as we rode those waves together. So that is the California experience that I understand the 60s had to offer just by listening to groups like this, not to mention Jan and Dean and others. But I mean, forget just the 60s kind of pop rock songs. When you get to Pet Sounds, when you get to 1966, and 65 before that, Brian Wilson had composed what music critics and fans alike had already started to determine was a new era of song for him, and that was California Girls. What he was doing with the arrangement, just the instruments and some of the vocalizations in that song. And, you know, California Girls turned into something that we had not heard from the Beach Boys yet. And it was kind of an indicator of the brilliance that was to come on Pet Sounds. Suddenly, Pet Sounds is released. We've got songs like God Only Knows. We've got songs like Wouldn't It Be Nice? We've got Brian's take on the folk classic Sloop John B. And not only that, but songs like Caroline No. This is some next level shit in the musicianship of this group and of the composer. And the Beatles were out there working on the Revolver album at the time. And the last song that they were working on for those sessions was called Here, There, and Everywhere. And immediately, McCartney is writing stuff in that song that is inspired by what he's just heard from the Beach Boys on Pet Sounds. A year later, the Beatles would put out Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album which the Beatles have recognized time and time again basically wouldn't have existed without Pet Sounds having come before it, and without, a year of being immersed in that sound and hearing kind of what the Beach Boys had done there. They went on to make sort of their own Pet Sounds, and it was Sgt. Pepper's. And so starting there, and then you move on to Elton John, you move on to Bruce Springsteen, you go on, 90s alternative groups like Everclear, not to mention Jellyfish, it's a little known one I wish more people knew about, all the way to Daft Punk themselves. You've got musicians who were touched by the Beach Boys and who wouldn't have been what they were without taking that influence in and kind of processing it and putting it back out into the world from their own perspective. It's been said that you might not like the Beach Boys, but you can bet your favorite band loves them. And so for that reason, I say you can't overstate the influence they had on others. When it was announced that Brian Wilson had passed away, I am not alone in having said something like this. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I made a dark joke when I first heard it. I said, Beach Boys fans across the planet said, why couldn't it have been Mike Love? And, that's irreverent and it's dark. And no, I don't wish Mike Love would pass away. I don't wish Mike Love would die. But I'm not going to pretend that, jokes like that weren't being made. And I'd like to talk about it for a second here. It is indicative of a very complicated relationship between Love and his cousin Brian Wilson for a long time, for decades. And thus a complicated relationship between him and the fans as well. Look, Mike Love is a very talented writer and performer and musician. He's somebody who, just like his cousin Brian, he's somebody who has formed the soundtrack of many of our lives for several generations. Not just the ones who were, fans listening as kids when this music came out for the first time, or the kids that they would go on to have, or the grandkids that those original fans would eventually have. No, I mean, this music is going to continue impressing and inspiring people for generations more. And I know that. And Mike Love is a very important part of that. But you can't talk about Brian Wilson and the career that he's had, I think, without talking about kind of the headbutting that he and his cousin Mike Love have done throughout those careers. I'm just going to say it. Mike Love tends to act like a dick publicly and in interviews. And I'm not being cynical here. A lot of people point out the 1988 Hall of Fame speech where Brian Wilson's trying to talk seriously from the heart about the honor that the band's getting. And Mike Love is just hovering around the microphone. And he starts calling out other bands and saying, well, I'd like to see the Stones get up and do what we do. And I bet the Boss couldn't hang like we do. And this one and that one. And he just starts calling out all these bands who are still successful touring and recording acts at that time. And he's essentially insulting them and shitting on them from the podium. And nobody really to this day even knows why. He claims there was some punchline he was going to deliver that he never did. You got moments like that. You've got, documented in countless biographies and books about their career, documentary films where they talk about when Brian Wilson is trying to get the band to record these complicated arrangements on the Pet Sounds album, things like he had not been writing up to that time. And of course, it might seem a little jarring to some of them who just kind of wanted another, little deuce coupe or something. But Mike is the one who steps up and says things like, who's going to hear this shit? The ears of a dog? That's a direct quote from several sources that of the kind of thing that he was saying to Brian about what he called, quote unquote, fucking with the formula. Mike would accuse Brian of trying to get too far away from the formula that made the Beach Boys successful, which was kind of the pop-oriented rock songs, which were your Surfer Girls and your Be True to Your Schools and things like that. And he didn't want Brian to go too far out on that limb. But going too far out on that limb is what gave an album like Pet Sounds to the world, which I think, if I might be misattributing this, but I think Elton John said that was the album that was still going to be listened to 100 years from now. If everyone else's albums turned to dust he believed that people would still be listening to Pet Sounds 100 years from Brian Wilson's death. I hope I'm not misattributing that. I think it was Elton who said that. But and this is what Brian Wilson accomplished by fucking with the formula and by going that far out from just the kind of box that they were in when they debuted and what made them famous to begin with. And Mike Love, for whatever reason, was very hesitant to do that. And he was also very famously negative in that same vein when Brian came back to them with something that was even more far out than the Pet Sounds stuff. He was trying to record the follow-up, Smile, in the year after Pet Sounds, and Mike was very against some of the stuff that he was hearing and having to record for Brian in the Smile sessions. And so he's one of the reasons, he's definitely not the reason, but he's one of the reasons that Brian eventually said, I'm just not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to focus on Smile. We're going to move on. I'm going to write some other stuff, and we're going to make some other music, and we're just going to kind of, maybe we'll take some of the influence of what I was trying to do here, and we'll infuse it with more of the kind of familiar poppy stuff that he being Mike Love and the fans might want to hear. And so it began kind of, being a big reason for the crisis of confidence that Brian Wilson had in the years that followed that, and why he pulled back a bit from the band and relinquished control to other members, and what happened. But anyway, so that's, if you're not familiar with the difficulties that Mike Love and his cousin Brian Wilson have basically had throughout their career, those are a couple of the reasons that people might feel that way and why jokes like that might be made, fairly or unfairly. Dark humor is not for everyone. And again, I certainly don't want to read the news that Mike Love has passed away, but there's a reason that people would joke like that. And there's a reason that, the specter of that difficult relationship hovered over this news in the last week. And there's been a lot of talk about it accordingly. So, and it's also, Mike Love has always kind of cast himself as a representative of the band's positivity in contrast to Brian Wilson's negativity. And what that doesn't properly respect is that the negativity on Brian Wilson's part that he's talking about is typically mental illness and a mind that has had to suffer depression and schizophrenia and paranoia and so many just horrible afflictions that Brian's had to not just deal with in some way and survive, but overcome enough to remain functional for several more decades after the onset of some of this stuff that he began dealing with in the late 60s and 70s. To the point where, at the end, he's, having to deal with dementia in the last few years of his life, as if he hadn't been through enough. And so, when you hear Mike Love throughout their careers and throughout their lives characterizing himself as representative of the positivity while Brian's the negativity, it's just, it hits people the wrong way, and it probably needs to be informed better. You almost want to appoint somebody to sit with him and just explain what some of this shit means. And the shitter of it is, I'm pretty sure he knows. I don't think that you need someone to sit and explain. I don't think someone needs to take on that responsibility. He knows. And so, for reasons like that, you get jokes like that, and you get insensitivity. People meet insensitivity with more insensitivity, which is not always the best strategy. I get that, but here we are. One more thing about their complicated relationship before we take another break. Mike was accused of firing Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys after they reunited in 2012. In 2012, the surviving Beach Boys reunited, and they put out one final album called That's Why God Made the Radio. And while it was not by any means another Pet Sounds, it wasn't going to be the album people thought of when you mentioned the Beach Boys for the rest of the time, but it was a very worthy reunion album. It was a great addition to their catalog, and it certainly made up for, in a lot of people's minds, the albums that came out in the 80s and 90s, specifically the last full original album they put out, which was called Summer in Paradise in 1992. There were some very questionable choices made on that album. They did like this sort of country duets album called Stars and Stripes around 95 or 96. And these were just not good notes to leave the recording career on. And so when they reunited, of course, we didn't have Carl Wilson anymore. He had passed away in the late 90s, and Dennis Wilson famously drowned in 1983. But we brought back Al Jardine. We brought back David Marks, who hadn't been with the guys since the 60s even. And we brought back Bruce Johnston. And everybody was together who could be and had been. And that's why God Made the Radio was a great album. A tour followed. They did several dates I think in spring and summer. And then it was announced that suddenly Brian, Al, and David were out, and that Mike Love was taking a different lineup of the Beach Boys onto other markets in the fall. They were going to do some dates, and Brian and the boys were no longer a part of it. And Mike swore up and down that was not his doing. He claimed he did not fire his cousin or the other band members. He had no power to do that, but that simply he had already made those dates for a different lineup of the Beach Boys to go and perform in these markets. Starting in October, I think it was, and by golly, it just needs to happen. We've already got contracts in place, so we're going to go play these shows. Well, meanwhile, Brian, Al, and these guys were sitting there publicly saying, we want to still be a part of this. We'd like to go play these shows. Why doesn't he want us there? And they didn't seem to understand why that was the case. Well, anytime Mike could, Mike was always on the road with the Beach Boys name making money, and I think he just wanted to get back to that. And I find it hard to believe that if the Beach Boys had reunited since he made these dates, since he booked these shows, you're going to tell me these markets would be pissed off if he showed up with Brian Wilson, Al Jardine, and David Marks? Come on. No. These markets would have killed for that. And so, no, it seems disingenuous to me that this just happened to fall apart for these reasons, and he has no control over it. We cannot ignore in the history of the Beach Boys that where Mike Love goes, there's usually controversy following along with him. But anyway, stick around with us. We're going to be right back after these messages. I've got a few more musings about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys that don't necessarily involve the conflict with Mike Love. We'll be right back.
Hey man, this is the Jazz Man. And did you know who the grooviest cat on the face of the planet is right now? Well, it might just be you, baby, because you're listening to WNUT.
Kids playing radio for 30 years. WNUT.
You are listening to WNUT Talk. I am Brandon, a.k.a. Stoney, sitting here talking about Brian Wilson, talking about the Beach Boys, talking about the good, the bad, I'm just trying to keep the summer alive over here, and warts and all, even if it pertains to the conflict between Brian Wilson and his cousin Mike Love. We're talking about it today. So, we were all sitting there minding our own business in 1988, man. It was a fun year. It was a great year. Oh, some great shit was on the charts. We started with George Michael's Faith. Man, George Harrison from the Beatles had Got My Mind Set on You. Michael Jackson was tearing it up with The Way You Make Me Feel. INXS had Need You Tonight. A little known singer named Rick Astley came out of nowhere with this hit called Never Gonna Give You Up. You probably never heard of it. You might not be aware of what that is. Whitney Houston with Where Do Broken Hearts Go? And if you keep on rolling down the year, man, we got some Steve Winwood with Roll With It. Guns N' Roses had Sweet Child of Mine. And then somewhere out of nowhere that fall, here comes the Beach Boys with Kokomo, went straight to #1 with a bullet from the movie Cocktail starring Tom Cruise. That song took the world by storm. People say that phrase all the time, and they just mean was popular. No, that song took the world by storm. Kokomo kicked the door in and said, I'm here now, and you're not getting rid of my ass. And boy, did we learn the frickin' geography of the Caribbean that year. Aruba, Jamaica. Ooh, I want to take you to Bermuda, Bahama. Come on, pretty mama. We knew all the goddamn islands because of that song. And the last time the Beach Boys had a #1 hit, remember, this is 1988. It had been more than 20 years. 1967, Good Vibrations went to #1, and that was the last time. They went #1 on the charts until 88, out of nowhere 21 years later with Kokomo. Holy shit. Why? I don't know. You want to talk about things that Mike Love did well. Kokomo's one of them. I know that song gets a lot of shit. People talk about how much they hate it. I don't know why. I mean, I don't see it as a bad song. I honestly think that's a good song. It's a catchy song. If it hadn't been as big as it was, I don't think people would hate on it as much. But holy shit, Mike Love wrote that, and just like that, the Beach Boys were back in a big ass way. Now, right around that time, 88, 89, somewhere in there. The year is lost to me at this point. I'd have to go back and see if I've got some documentation somewhere, which the way that I keep shit, I probably do. But around 88, 89, I was in elementary school, and I was in this little extracurricular program called SOAR, SOAR, Students on Active Research. And what it was I think every Wednesday, they would put a few of the more creative kids on a bus. They would take us to this other off-site campus, and we were encouraged, man. They fed our minds. They taught us how to kind of think differently. They taught us how to construct, whether it was a narrative for stories or think of things creatively, songwriting. Just we had that muscle in our brains exercised on a regular. And one of the things that they did was this thing called Creative Challenge. They'd put you in groups of other students, and you had to come up with something. It was very open-ended. You could kind of do anything you wanted with it. But you had to get on stage. You had to present something that was maybe, 3 to 5 minutes or whatever. And some people did like a little dramatic reading or, like a play type thing. Some people did kind of a dance. We came up with kind of a live music video. Me and the other students decided we were going to do Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys. We're going to make these surfboards out of construction paper or poster boards or whatever. I played the part of the lifeguard who was kind of pissed off. The kids were down there surfing. I was like, hey, it's dangerous. Don't be doing this. There's not enough lifeguards out here. I'm trying to get them to stop. As the song continues, they're just ignoring the lifeguard. They're going out there, they're surfing, they're having a good time. Finally, me as the lifeguard, I toss the whistle aside, and I'm like, screw it. And I grab a surfboard and I join them, and we all, we have a good time, and they've won me over as the authority figure, and everybody's gone surfing USA. So that and Kokomo were probably my first two major exposures to the Beach Boys. Yeah, I was always aware of songs like I Get Around and Help Me Rhonda and Barbara Ann, some of the other ones that I named in past segments here today, but I always was aware of the Beach Boys, so I always knew their music. But then here comes Kokomo and that Creative Challenge, and so yeah, I kind of had a soft spot in my heart for them, as they would then go on to appear on my sister and my favorite show growing up, Full House. We loved watching Full House every Friday night, and because John Stamos would often play drums for the Beach Boys would appear on that show, and so we would see them that way, and so they were just kind of always there. They were always a part of my life, in that way. But I'll honestly say that one of my favorite adventures in music was when I really decided to immerse myself in the Beach Boys catalog and just listen to their albums and listen to, the whole of their output, I guess, as more than just a casual observer or listener. So when I started collecting the albums and really listening to what everything before Pet Sounds was like, and Pet Sounds and the Aborted Smile album, and how that changed what they would do, and everything that came after. It was such a fun journey and such an interesting one. And I wish I could have that experience again of kind of letting that music wash over me again for the first time, but you obviously can never go back and experience it the way you did that first time. So I cannot recommend enough, taking in that mountain of music and really just experiencing it and kind of trying to understand the band as thoroughly as you can. It's a great trip. So going back to his childhood, Brian Wilson used to listen to this group of singers called the Four Freshmen. And, they would do a lot of a cappella stuff, and they had these beautiful harmonies. Their sound would envelop you, and the way they would blend their voices was just angelic. And he loved them so much. He loved, I think he had heard them from his mother. His mother had introduced their music to him, and he would meticulously transcribe the parts that they were singing. And he would teach those parts to his brothers, Carl and Dennis. And then the Wilsons would replicate the Four Freshmen song arrangements, and they learned to sing harmony that way. And in fact, there's a song that they did. The Four Freshmen recorded a song called Their Hearts Were Full of Spring. And the Beach Boys would reinterpret that as A Young Man Is Gone. song about James Dean, but it was to the tune of Their Hearts Were Full of Spring. Just a beautiful arrangement. And so that is where kind of the Beach Boys harmony came from. It grew out of his love for the Four Freshmen. If you're a casual fan of the Beach Boys, or if you're just somebody who's kind of peripherally aware of them, if you're not somebody who's dived into their catalog, you might not know that Brian Wilson was actually deaf in one ear. So he never had much use for stereo. That's why there's a lot of Beach Boys master recordings, and their albums were in mono for so long. And Pet Sounds was famously in mono until a stereo version came out in the 90s. Brian couldn't hear it any other way. So he would sit and oversee mixes accordingly. He didn't hear two channels. It wasn't until after the breakdown of Smile and Brian stepped back from the band for a bit, they really started using stereo more to its capabilities. So after, I mentioned Pet Sounds, and I mentioned Mike Love kind of not wanting to change the formula up too much that had made them successful. Brian Wilson started to get a lot of pressure from the record company about the arrangements on Smile being very ambitious. And, people were starting to worry that he was going to follow up Pet Sounds with this very avant-garde album. And to a point, he kind of was. He was going to do a little more experimental and creative stuff than he had been doing. But I think the reports were greatly exaggerated as to how experimental he was going to make it. There were certainly going to be radio-ready hits and chart-friendly music on Smile. But he was also doing some very symphonic things, and he was doing some very artistic and interpretive things. And one of the things that he was doing a suite of different songs that were based on the elements, so like air, earth, water, fire, that kind of thing. And reportedly, when he came to the fire element, the band did several days or maybe a week or so of recording the track that was going to be Fire. And he was recording different parts that were all going to be mixed into this. And they spent so much time recording Fire. And after that, in the weeks that followed, there were a rash of fires in the LA area. Now, the reality is there was an arsonist on the loose out there setting these fires who was eventually, if I remember correctly, caught. But Brian freaked the fuck out. He's starting to kind of have some of these struggles I mentioned with his mind and with his mental capacity and with paranoia and things like that. And so he actually freaked out and thought that maybe this music they were making, because it was so fire-themed, that they were causing these fires out there somehow. And he famously just kind of shut down production for a bit. Not this wasn't fully. He didn't stop working on it at that point. But it has been kind of pointed to as a contributing factor into what eventually made the Smile sessions shut down. But so you're seeing here kind of where his mind was at that time and how troubled he was. Mike was clashing with Van Dyke Parks, who was the lyricist on Smile. Mike didn't seem to understand what a lot of the stuff that Van Dyke was writing was supposed to mean. Yeah, some of it was some of it was a bit poetic. Some of it was out there a bit. You had a lot of creative license with Van Dyke Parks lyrics. Not that they were bad, but they were different. And so there was conflict. There were pressures from outside sources. The label was stepping in, starting to worry about some of what Brian was writing and how much it was costing and how much the band was having to record to make this happen. An album on this scale had I want to say hadn't really been attempted yet. I'm probably wrong there, but probably not with the I guess, mountain of obstacles to overcome that Smile ran into. And so Smile eventually did get shut down. And Brian did step back. And Brian would be in and out of the band kind of, for the next several years. In 75, they had a big to-do when Brian was back for the 15 Big Ones albums. And Brian would famously find himself in the care of Dr. Eugene Landy, who was supposed to address some of his mental problems. And Landy eventually went on to basically just become kind of a manager and minder and controller of Brian, to the point where Landy was receiving royalties for the stuff that Brian was doing. And Landy had to be exposed as somebody who was there to sort of feed off of Brian and to take advantage of him. And Landy eventually got sent away. So yeah, look, when people talk about how troubled Brian's life has been, you can't really exaggerate it. I don't think you can over-represent how difficult things were for Brian. And even when he was well, even when he got better, how hard he had to work to stay better. And the fact that he was able to do all of this and to create all of this and give us all of this through all of that, to me, is something miraculous, which I don't think too many people would have been capable of. I can't honestly say that more than a handful of people would have been able to persevere through the things that he had to, but especially to give us what he did and to make the mark that he did through it all. It's mind-blowing to me. It's hard enough for me to make the mediocre music that I make on my best days, which are pretty free of a lot of conflict. And so to compare and contrast that against what he was up against and what he accomplished, I simply don't think that words have been coined yet that I could use to express how overwhelming the miracle was that he pulled off. And I mean that. I absolutely mean that. In 2004, you know what happened? Brian Wilson finally sat down and gave us the Smile album. He finally sat down with all the tapes and the sessions, and he put them together in a way that made sense, and he wrote parts that needed to be written, and he recorded, and he sequenced, and he gave us Smile. He recorded it with his own band. It wasn't the Beach Boys. It was Brian Wilson Presents Smile, but he finally made Smile, and he gave it to us, and it was phenomenal. And a world was finally able to listen to a version of this. I highly doubt, and most people highly doubt, that it was what would have come out in 1967. But we were finally able to hear Smile and react to Smile, and it was incredible. It truly was a gift from the gods. And finally, several years later, 2011, I think, the Beach Boys box set of Smile sessions finally came out, which included a disc that sequenced the Smile album from the Beach Boys recordings. Yeah, a lot of that stuff had come out in the years following the breakdown of Smile. We got a lot of the songs from Smile on the albums 2020 and Surf's Up, and one called Smiley Smile, wink wink, among other places, some bootlegs and shit like that. But yeah, this was the first time we had heard a lot of the actual Beach Boys recordings of the Smile record, of the Smile album, sequenced properly, put together the way that Brian wanted it to be done. And again, not what would have come out in 67, but pretty damn close. And my God, I just try to imagine what it would have been like if this had been allowed, if this had been able to emerge when it was supposed to, if Brian had been able to pull this off, and all the forces that worked against him had just let him do what he was doing. And if he had been able to give the world that album at the same time the Beatles put out Sgt. Pepper's, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine how the music world would have reacted. I can't imagine how it would have inspired what came next. I can't imagine what next would have been like. It's fun to try, though. So, Brian, we love you. We're going to miss you. God only knows what we'd be without you. This has been WNUT Talk. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. I hope so much that you'll go listen to your favorite Beach Boys record right now. Listen to some of your favorite Beach Boys albums, some of your favorite songs. And if you don't know the Beach Boys that well, if you're not that familiar, go discover them. I hope that you'll just let that music wash over you like the surf at a California beach, and let it take you somewhere right now. We will be back again very soon when the topic will be, hey, who knows? I never do. We'll discover that together right here on WNUT Talk.